Hey everyone, Matt Williams here from Noonan. And over the past 2 years, I have really studied dispersion patterns and I have become obsessed. I think this is the key unlock to helping anyone improve their game. And the best part, you don't even have to change your swing. Let me explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about. So, if you're not familiar with a dispersion pattern is effectively the pattern that your shots will form around your intended target. A lot of people think that your shots kind of go directly at where you are trying to hit it, and if it doesn't land there, then you just hit a bad swing. Well, that's not actually the case, right? People talk about play your misses. That's effectively what a dispersion pattern is trying to show you, what your misses are, so that you can apply the right course management strategy to make sure that you take big misses out of play and that you give yourself the best odds for success on every single shot. So if I were to ask you to hit 100 shots at this flag, it would form this dispersion pattern. It looks something like this. Now, everyone's dispersion is a little bit different, but the key here is I don't know which one of these shots is coming next, right? I may hit it great and it may end up near the middle, or I may hit it poorly. You can't predict it, right? Otherwise, we'd hit hole in ones all the time. Now, what you can predict though is your next shot will land somewhere in this general area, right? So you can kind of draw a circle around it, and you know pretty confidently that your next shot will land somewhere in that circle. Now, this is where most people stop when it comes to dispersion patterns. They effectively say, okay, here's kind of your historical shots. Here's a nice circle that kind of best fits that dispersion. And why don't you go try and make some decisions based off of that? Not really that useful, if you ask me. There's so much more that we can be doing with this. And that's what I spent the past year and a half going and really diving into the math that allows us to use this much more effectively. So let's talk about that. So again, let's go into the anatomy of a dispersion pattern. The very first thing you have to understand are your averages. Most people understand an average distance that your shot will go, in the air, like your carry distance. So in this case, my average shot will go about 150 yards. What often gets misunderstood is your aim line versus your target. So in this particular case, every single time I'm trying to hit it right at that flag, right? That's where I'm trying to hit it, but I tend to fade it. So on average, my shots end up about 3 yards to the right of where I was trying to aim. So if you think about that in practice, what that means is if you want your shots to land near the flag, right, the landing point, you actually need to aim every single time 3 yards to the left of that. Now, most people don't understand this. They will aim directly at the flag, not knowing their tendency, and they'll wonder why the majority of their shots end up a little bit further away. So, if you're going to play the numbers, the best thing to do is understand what your average offline is and then aim accordingly. Now, the next thing we need to understand is your variance. Now, this is essentially your miss. And this is a little bit more in depth. You actually have to apply a little bit of math in order to figure this out. But more or less, there's some predictability when it comes to your shots in this particular case. And variance is effectively how big of a miss you have. So if I hit it great on average, it'll go 150. If I flush it and hit it a little bit further, it might go 156 or 162. Shots may go 140, 138, but on average, they all equate to 150. Now, good players will have smaller variances. Poor players will have large variances. So you may have a good player that averages 150, but their variance is only, 5 or 6 yards. So a good shot goes 156, a bad shot goes 144. A high handicap golfer may have a much larger miss. So some shots may go 165, some shots may go 135, but on average it still comes out to 150. You have to know what your miss is, because if you've got trouble that you need to be aware of, if you miss hit that, you don't want that next shot to go into that penalty area and leave yourself in a bad position. So you need to account for that when you're making some of these shot strategy decisions. Now, what you're going to see here is a lot of these shots are again, going into kind of more advanced statistics, they form a bell curve, right? And a variance is effectively a way for you to calculate the odds your next shot will go a very specific distance. So, one way that we do that is effectively looking at one standard deviation versus two standard deviations. So, one standard deviation against your mean is essentially your miss on either end of the mean. So some may go 6 yards longer, some may go 6 yards longer. But the nice thing is within one standard deviation, high and low, that means 68% of your shots will land somewhere within that range. So 68% of my shots, because I have a 6 yard variation, will land between 144 and 156. So if I'm playing pretty great, I can feel like that's a pretty good estimation. Now, if I have a big hazard to contend with, I want to maybe go a little bit more conservative with that. So if I go two standard deviations, so 12 yards on either end of my mean, then that represents 95% of my shot pattern. So 95% of my shots will land between 138 and 162. Again, applying that to a golf course, I can see here if I've got a 144 yards is this forced carry situation. Well, I can confidently say that 84% of my shots will be longer than that 144-yard distance. So you can kind of pick out these forced carry situations and actually calculate what your odds are to carry a specific number if you know what your standard deviation or your variance is for your different clubs. So just like there's variation or misses in your distance control, there's also variation in how far left, right you hit your shots. And again, we see that normal bell curve where in the middle, we've got our average offline, which we talked about before. That's 3 yards. So every time I hit a shot on average, it's going to land about 3 yards right of where I'm trying to hit it. Now, typically your offline miss is a little bit bigger than your carry distance. Hopefully, you've got a little bit better distance control than you do with your offline. But what we can see here is based on the data set that we've captured, my offline variance is 12 yards. So again, looking at that bell curve, don't have to be an expert in statistics, but we're looking at one standard deviation on either side. Essentially, you take that variance and you apply it on both sides. So on average, I am, missing my shots 12 yards to the right, 12 yards to the left, between those two numbers about 68% of the time. And if we look at what it would be for 95% of my shots, basically we look at the two standard deviations. So kind of the further ends of that bell curve. So I'm going to miss my shots 21 yards left of my intended aim line and 27 yards right of my intended aim line about 95% of the time. So the really cool thing about this is once we understand what our miss variance is, then we can apply a little bit of statistics in order to figure out how far you can push your dispersion left to right before you bring too much trouble into play. So here's a good example, right? I've got water off to the right. I want to make sure that, I can maybe move my dispersion as close to that edge as possible without, bringing too much trouble on the right into play. Now, the way that you do this is if you were actually doing this, statistically, you would essentially solve for how, what is the odds your shot will end up left of a specific number. So let's just take a random number like 15 yards, which is also happens to be kind of that first standard deviation mark. So essentially what this says is what are my odds that my next shot will land left of a mark that we put 15 yards right of my target aim line. So I've got my target aim line. I go 15 yards to the right of it. What's my odds my next shot will land left of that? And turns out you can actually solve that. When you know your averages and you know your variance, you can actually solve for the odds that your next shot will be left of a specific mark. And in this particular case, since we're using a nice normal standard deviation, we can say that it's a pretty simple calculation. 84% of your shots will land left of that mark. And that gives me a pretty good indication to say, okay, how far right can I actually push this? And you can apply different numbers to that. Or, of course, you can download the Noonan app and it'll do it for you. Now, we've looked at carry and offline both individually, but as I'm sure you're aware, these things actually are correlated to each other, meaning the carry and the offline actually are, they come together, and there's a relationship between the two. And you've probably seen that in reality, your dispersion pattern isn't kind of this nice, oval, it actually has a tilt to it, and it looks more like this. Now, statistically, this is called your covariance, or effectively the amount of rotation that happens. Now, the reason why there's a rotation, I'm a right-handed golfer, so for a right-handed golfer, this is generally true. For a left-handed golfer, you're going to see the opposite. But essentially, there's a tilt to dispersion because the further right that I hit it, typically your face is open. When you open your face, it creates more loft and the ball goes shorter. When you hit it further off to the left, that means you've effectively closed your club face, which causes the ball to go left, de-lofts it, and that causes it to go a little bit further. Right. So that's kind of what causes that variation. Now every play is a little bit different. They're going to have, different covariance and a different rotation. But understanding that your dispersion does have rotation is really important. You may have seen this video on the Golf Channel where it looks at why right-handed golfers struggle so much on number 12 at Augusta. And it's exactly for this purpose. It's because you've got a tilt, and the tilt to your dispersion pattern effectively brings more water into play the further right you go. So in order for you to really take that water out of play, you've got to move your dispersion way far to the left or club up quite significantly. And it's just an overall really tough shot simply because of the typical dispersion pattern for a right-handed golfer. For a left-handed golfer, it's actually quite easy because your rotation of your dispersion aligns very nicely with the rotation of the green. So kind of no matter where I put that, distance-wise, the vast majority of my shots are going to land somewhere on the green because that rotation is angled pretty darn nicely with where the green is. Now, the last really amazing thing that we have done with Noonan and that has kind of come up in my research is this concept of being able to calculate your odds, right? What is your odds, or what are your odds for that next shot to go into a specific area of the golf course? And I kind of became obsessed with this idea. So many times I hear people talk about play the high percentage shot, but we don't actually know what that means, right? Nobody's ever defined what is a high percentage shot. How do you quantify that? Is it 80%? Is it 20%? How do you come up with those percentages? This is kind of an abstract term for something that can actually be quantified, which just blew my mind. When we look at the statistics, I can actually solve for these values. So take, for example, I've got green, a little bit of a bunker in my dispersion pattern. What are the odds my next shot will land somewhere in that bunker, right? It turns out this is a solvable equation. If I know what my dispersion is, I know what my averages are, I know what my variance is, we can actually calculate the odds your next shot will land somewhere in that bunker. That is going to, number one, tell you exactly where you should position. So if we can do that for a bunker, we can do that for a green, we can do that for rough, we can do that for water, so on and so forth. So then the game effectively becomes, okay, how can I position your dispersion pattern in a way on the golf course that gives you the highest odds to hit your target while also minimizing the odds of hitting it into a penalty area? Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is an extremely difficult concept to be able to actually go deliver because we're talking about integrating very abstract shapes, and we've got rotation to deal with, and we've got GPS coordinates, and there's a lot that goes into it. So we spent a ton of time and investment in figuring out a way to actually go do this within the Noonan application. But the amazing thing is this works. We can take data from a golf simulator, create a statistical representation of your dispersion pattern, calculate based off of your aim and your club combination what your odds are your next shot will land in a specific area of the golf course, and then use that to optimize where you should hit your next, or what club and aim you should use for your next shot. We have now effectively solved golf, right? We have literally created an equation that makes sure you mathematically, not abstractly, mathematically play the highest percentage shot every single time. And we put that into an app. You can take this out on the golf course. You can use Noonan with a one push of the button. Noonan's going to do all that science, all those calculations for you, identify the best landing place for your dispersion pattern, tell you exactly where you need to aim in order for your next shot to land within the dispersion pattern that's already optimized for you. and then give you those percentages of your likelihood that next shot will land in each area of the golf course. And from there, right? Now you've got data to work with. If you want to take on more risk, you can change your aim line. You can add more club, take away club, and see what your odds will change. So you can truly do a risk reward analysis based off of the different club and aim combinations that you're going to look at. And this to me is the way that you maximize your potential on every single round. If you play the highest percentage shot every single time, then no longer is strategy a reason why you're going to shoot a bad score, right? You are playing with objectively the best strategy. Now, you can always improve your dispersion pattern. You can always improve your swing. Of course, you can always play better shots. But when you're playing golf, you want to play with the swing that you have, right? And you come to the golf course, you've already put in your preparation. You've already, worked at the range. You've gotten to your game to the best it can. Now it's time to go out and play with the swing you have. And Noonan is going to ensure that you get the most potential out of each round.